Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Robin Runge. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the current chair of the American Bar Association's Civil Rights and Social Justice section. And it is my honor and privilege wearing that hat for this year and to host these chair chats twice a month when we get to learn from some of our esteemed leaders in the section. And that is exactly what we're doing today. It is my privilege and honor to introduce Roula Allouch, who is a member of the Leadership Council for the section. And she is also a trial attorney with experience handling a range of litigation matters in the areas of employment, civil rights, personal injury, and appeals. And she earned her undergrad degree at the University of Kentucky. We were just in Louisville for the mid-year meeting, so that means something different to me now, and her law degree from the University of Kentucky as well. She is an active member of the legal community and the community at large, as I mentioned. She's extremely active in the American Bar Association, and we rely on her leadership in the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. She also is the past chair of the National Board of Directors of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, which is the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy group for the American Muslim community. And she serves as the chair of the American Bar Association's Center for Human Rights and serves on the Leadership Council, as I said, for us. She's also been recognized as a Daughter of Greatness by the Muhammad Ali Center, which I got to visit when we were in Louisville, and serves on the center's board of directors. She's also a faculty member with the Islamic Seminary of America, and she has a passion for the arts and recently joined the leadership committee for the Over the Rhine International Film Festival. That's fabulous to learn.
So much fun.
That sounds I want to know more about that another time. But we're thrilled to have Roula with us today because, as you know from the title, our topic today really is to dig into deepening our understanding of what Islamophobia is, how it manifests in our laws, what it looks like, how people experience it, its prevalence, and why this is a critical issue for lawyers to really be sure that we understand and that we're playing our role to fight against it, right, when we see it, and use our leadership in our communities to make sure that we are identifying it and providing necessary leadership when we can. And so for that reason, Rola, I'm just really appreciative of your time and your leadership in this area. And I think a great place to start would be just to help define for us what Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, how does that manifest so that we know how we're grounding ourselves for the rest of our conversation. And thank you again.
Thanks, Robin. It's good to be with you, and I'm happy to be here to discuss this important topic. To me, it's really a manifestation of anti-Muslim bias, and it shows up in different ways. It can be institutional, governmental, social. As a Muslim who's lived her whole life in the US and gone through school and then living as a professional working in our country, it just reflects itself in so many different ways. And of course, Islamophobia isn't just based within the US, it's a global phenomenon issue that's happening where we see Islamophobia impacting communities around the world. And so it's a manifestation of the anti-Muslim bias and hatred that people have, fear that people have about Muslims. And there are all those different ways that it shows up.
Yeah, no, so that's really helpful to ground us. And I think giving some examples will be helpful because I think that there may be some misunderstandings. I mean, how does that manifest, right? Because, for example, is this more, is it intertwined with racism, or is it intertwined with harassment and discrimination based on someone's religious affiliation? You know, I think if I could ask you to just pull those strings for me a little bit further, I think it would
Yeah.
be.
Yeah, I think that a lot of those issues, and would be no surprise to many, they're intersectional. So interestingly, there's a Muslim woman who's visibly Muslim, and I have had so many instances where I think there's an interconnection of anti-Muslim, Islamophobic hatred, and also misogyny. And those
Mm-hmm.
have been ways I've seen them multiple times in my life, but also in examples of community issues that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
And really, a lot of these isms and phobias are directly linked towards issues of white supremacy. And so an anti-Muslim bias, anti-Black racism,
Mhm.
there's so many different isms and phobias, unfortunately, that we deal with in our society. And I think a lot of them are interconnected back to those issues of white supremacy. It's part of why I think it's so important for all of us to work together, that shoulder to shoulder, side by side, to combat
Mhm.
all of these challenges that our communities face, so that we're pushing back on the systems themselves and not just piecemealing certain parts of them.
Yeah, and it sounds like a key piece of this will is through education and awareness of what it means to be Muslim,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because I think some people perceive that it's a particular race that is Muslim, right?
yeah.
Or, I mean, I can go on, right? Or you're from
Well,
a certain
it's
country, right? And you're automatically Muslim, right? Or if you don't wear, as a woman particularly, if you don't wear a covering on your head, then you're not Muslim. I think I just need to out all of these things
Yeah,
that,
you're so right. I mean,
yeah,
it's interesting. We're having this conversation in Arab American Heritage Month, and there's always this misperception that all Muslims are Arab or all Arabs are Muslim, and
right,
neither of
right,
those things are true. Yeah, there's
right.
a sizable group of Arabs who are of different faith communities, Christian and otherwise, and there are a lot of Muslims who are not Arab. And those are common misperceptions that people have.
Yeah,
Of course, we could probably have an entire conversations about women's rights within Islam and
yeah.
talking about the hijab, the head covering. But yes, there's so many people that misidentify or misunderstand a women's role in our faith, and also based on whether there's a hijab on, whether it's being
Mm-hmm.
worn or not, how it's being worn.
Mm-hmm.
I often say, I can't wait for the day when people stop worrying about what people of any faith background are wearing and just worry about what we're talking about and doing. Because the wearing part to me is a very personal decision and choice, and not what people should be focusing on. But of course,
Right.
that's a daydream for now.
Well, and that choice, I would argue, you're aware places you at greater risk for experiencing harassment, say on the street, or denial of access to a space because of the perceptions that people have of that. I'm guessing that's a part of your process every
Yeah,
day in your
yeah,
decision making.
that's
Yeah.
absolutely correct. And actually, it's also a part of my decision making to wear the hijab, to identify as Muslim and to be a visible Muslim woman, because I want to push back against the stereotypes that exist against our community, and especially against women in our community, and to not allow us to have to change how we present ourselves or identify ourselves
To be
just
safe.
to acquiesce. Right, right.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that there aren't times that I'm not very aware of my hijab and very aware that I might be in a dangerous space. Um,
Mhm.
there are too many examples I can think of where I personally felt a sense of danger and had kind of that thought with myself of how to be protective, because I am visibly Muslim and I'm sensing tension or a person's
Mhm.
gaze or a person's actions towards me.
Mhm.
That's definitely a part of the consideration. But to me, it's important to defend our First Amendment right. And so it's kind of that's the choice I have, is
Yeah.
to adamantly defend and protect that right by wearing it, even though it can be scary at times and it can bring on, and it has. I mean, there are too many examples of women being harassed and attacked because of their presence as visible Muslim women.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to appreciate the bravery. It shouldn't take bravery,
Yeah, it
right?
shouldn't,
It
but thank
shouldn't
you.
take it, but it does. And I that's my perception. I'll just say it that way. But I really appreciate you articulating that because I don't think that many of us fully appreciate what you've just shared. And then as a lawyer, I can only imagine that you have experienced bias and discrimination in your practice.
Yeah.
I'd love to have you share a little bit about that and how that manifests.
Yeah, I wish I didn't have the stories to tell, Robin, but
Yeah.
fortunately I do. And they go back to when I was in law school and was dealing with people who um, were expressing anti-Muslim sentiment, either in my property law class, where I had a professor that it was evident that she had an anti-Muslim woman bias, and she had this misperception about women's rights within Islam. And so there were a lot of tense conversations between the two of us in class publicly.
In front of everybody. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that obviously is not something that classmates had to deal with that weren't Muslim. And it was another way of targeting a Muslim student. I think at the time I was the only one in my class, my law class. So it wasn't the easiest scenario, but it's oftentimes Islamophobia and these types of issues come from a person in a position of power. So like, for example, one time I was in court ready to represent a client, and my client happened to be a white male who had come to court professionally dressed. And when we were beginning the hearing, the judge immediately, when we were, the first thing you do is introduce yourself, introduce your client. And when I began to speak, he put his hand up and kind of stopped me from speaking and said, ma'am, you need to be quiet. You need to stop. You need to let your lawyer speak. Because his assumption was my client was the lawyer. And when
Wow.
the client gets red in the face, because that's such an uncomfortable position for him to be in. And I mean, I had to go back on the record with the court judge back and forth to confirm that I'm the lawyer. And it ultimately, that back and forth resolved with the judge suggesting that, well, we'd completed the paperwork incorrectly and I'd signed as the client and he'd signed as the lawyer, which of course we hadn't done. But it shows up everywhere that, I showed up to that hearing not expecting at all to deal with that kind of attack. And then it happens, and it happens in front of the client. And it's just something that, unfortunately, our society hasn't done enough to make Islamophobia something that is unacceptable. And I have heard others, a friend and scholar of Islamophobia, Khalid Beydoun, has shared repeatedly, and I agree with him, that Islamophobia is the last accepted form of discrimination. That as a society, we have elected officials, we have government officials, people in the media, all types of people who throw out Islamophobic sentiment or actions, and they aren't held accountable in the way that they would if it was an attack on other communities. And that's something that, especially those of us that are social justice minded, really need to work to stop, because it's unacceptable for any community to deal with an element of hate or those types of biases impacting them, particularly at school, at work, in governments, institutions, policies, those types of things. And unfortunately, our community is dealing with all of that. And we're still working to get the appropriate level of solidarity and kind of impact of making a change and pushing Islamophobia into the space that the other isms and phobias are appropriately in, where as a general rule, society says that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, and I think the other piece of this puzzle that's so important is the prevalence of it, and the lack of awareness of the prevalence of it. As we were talking in preparation for this, we were acknowledging that I think really incredibly difficult tragedies that have led to increases of violence and manifestations of Islamophobia are both 9/11 and then most recently October 7th, and the atrocities that have continued, unfortunately, to affect so many. And yet we know that Islamophobia did not come into being right after September 11th of 2001. But if you could just really help us understand that, I think it's important, right? Like that this is, you just said, made me think of it, right? That this is an ism, an oppression tool that has existed for people who identify as Muslim for as long as there have been Muslim people, as far as I can tell.
And it's systemic and it's institutionalized in a lot of ways,
Yes.
just like those other isms that we
Yes.
talk about. Yeah, and of course, Islamophobia didn't manifest itself in the post 9/11 world. It certainly increased in significant ways. And when we talk about Islamophobia, it's also important to point out the Sikh community and how they've been negatively impacted by, it's almost guilt by association, that people misperceive members of the Sikh community as Muslim because of the wearing of a turban. In fact, the first person who was killed in an Islamophobic incident after 9/11 was a Sikh man who
Mm,
was identified as Muslim. So,
right.
that's another piece of information that's important for people to understand. But those markers in time, I think we've seen an increase in Islamophobia and an increase in attacks, not just verbal but physical, on members of our community. So certainly it's important to note that Islamophobia pre-existed that, and in a lot of ways to understand that there are institutions and there's an industry that's working to perpetuate Islamophobia, that there are those in positions of power in places that benefit from a notion of Muslims being violent, Muslims being evil, Muslims being terrorists.
Right.
That is a narrative that is frequently and commonly pushed. If you look at media, I mean, it's always interesting because I grew up in the US, so I would take in our media. I took in our films and cartoons, and I'm a kid that grew up in the US. I also was
Yeah.
living in a Muslim Arab home, and I would have to grapple with what people were putting on our community that I knew in my heart and in my experience wasn't accurate, but I was also taking it in, and that's part of that systemic issue where they try
Mm-hmm.
to force those stereotypes and tropes and misperceptions on people. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, what's happened the last 6 months in Gaza is a direct reflection of what happens when you dehumanize a population,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what's happened is Muslims have been dehumanized. And of course, it's more complicated than saying just Muslim, because all people in Gaza are not Muslim. Of course, there's a sizable Palestinian Christian community, but it's that othering that has happened, the dehumanization that has happened. And as an Arab and a Muslim in America in the last 6 months, it's been really difficult to work with people professionally, interact with people in my daily life who are not appalled at what the people in Gaza are experiencing right now, and knowing that it's a manifestation of that hatred that has been systemically instilled and encouraged and placed in people. It's just been very difficult to navigate all of that. And at the same time, understand that there are people that are being physically harmed as a result of all of these things, as a result of this dehumanization. And not just over there, by the way. I mean, we were chatting
Mm-hmm.
about this before, that there are people in the US who have been killed and attacked as a result of this Islamophobic anti-Arab sentiment that has been just surrounding us.
Yeah.
And we've got to all do better so that those things don't continue to happen.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for again for sharing your personal experiences and how there are these that this is always prevalent, Islamophobia. It never goes away, and yet there are these inflection points, unfortunately, that lead to increased misinformation and fear.
Yeah, I
That
can tell you,
makes
Robin, that
yeah.
as a visible Muslim woman, there are times where I am on higher alert. I tend to always be aware of my surroundings, especially
Mm-hmm.
I'm protective. So if I'm around other community members or family, especially younger people, I tend to be, protective and mindful of surroundings. But like, for example, in the Trump era, that was a time period where I was on higher alert. And unfortunately, on October 9th, when I was walking down the street in Cincinnati, headed to my office, I had this awareness kind of washed over me that, like, oh, we're on high alert again. And
Mm,
have had to stay on high alert since that time period because of the rhetoric that's being used against members of the Palestinian community, a majority of whom are Muslim, or a large number of whom are Muslim. So
hmm.
it's it's tough. Yeah,
Well, and it's exhausting. I
yeah.
mean, and again, this is where I have learned from my sisters and brothers who describe about their experiences walking down the street being Black, right?
Mhm.
Or walking down the street, just these are things that because of my privilege and my skin color, I experienced the gendered components of what you've shared in a different way, a distinctive way.
Mhm.
But I can't possibly, and that's exhausting, just that little piece of the puzzle. So I can't even imagine the burden that places and the decisions, again, as we've talked about, you have continued to live your life, but I bet, and I wouldn't blame others for staying inside more, for making choices to not do things. because of the things you've described. And I think I just want to lift up something we talked about in preparation for this, is I found this survey that was done back in 2021 by the Othering and Belonging Institute at Berkeley in California. And it really emphasizes what you're saying, which is almost 2/3 of the respondents said that they had either personally experienced or know someone who had been affected by anti-Muslim or Islamophobic, again, statements, harassment, just a variety of manifestations. And as a result, um, almost 33% of the people who were surveyed admitted to hiding their religious identity at some point in their lives because of these experiences or fears, and that and an overwhelming percentage, 88.2%, answered that they censor their speech or actions due to fear of how people might react. And I just, there's more, we're going to share this link because there are more, but I just wanted to really help people understand and contextualize what you're graciously sharing with us today. And you mentioned institutionalization of this, and I think that's the last thing that I want to make sure that we talk about today, and that is there is institutionalization of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, and that is primarily in the form of passing anti-Sharia legislation. And there has been a massive increase in legislation, both introduced and adopted on the state level, as well as, just remind ourselves, anti-Muslim federal policies like registries, surveillance programs, and if you'll recall, in the early, very beginning of former President Trump's term, the Muslim ban, the travel ban, right? I remember that like it was, I mean, so I just want to be clear when you say institutionalized, like I want to lift up what we're talking about in very concrete terms. And again, we're going to share the link to this website, but it has this unbelievably helpful chart, and it shows that over 230 anti-Muslim bills have been introduced or enacted in US state legislatures since 2010. And they are institutionalizing othering and oppression and discrimination of Muslims in the United States. And they serve to strengthen, right, this unfounded fear that you articulated, right, of Islam
Right.
and Muslims. And so people sometimes say, oh, it's institutionalized, and they don't fully appreciate the impact, right? And it creates this climate of intolerance toward Muslims. And so I'd love it if you could just, before we finish, talk a little bit about what an anti-Sharia, what an anti-Muslim or anti-Sharia legislation is. Just give one example, because I'm now introduced another term that many of us don't know, including myself, very much about Sharia. So if I may impose on you to help us understand that, building off of what I've just shared.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think all of those are good examples of institutionalized Islamophobia. I mean, flying while Muslim is its own phenomenon, and the
Right.
federal government has a watch list that has been used to target members of our community since the post 9/11 days, and every presidential administration since it was first enacted have maintained it. And actually, the CAIR team just very recently had a historic legal victory where this United States Supreme Court, so that's important, and we're talking to lawyers, so people
Right.
understand this,
Right.
in a 9-0 decision, ruled in favor of CAIR's moving forward against the watch list. And that was pivotal. And it's funny, one of my colleagues joked that anyone who gets a 9-0 decision from this court should automatically get attorney's fees. But that kind of joke aside, for this court to have ruled in that way against
Yes.
on an issue of the watch list, I think uh, just reflects the severity of it and its disparate impact on members of the Arab and Muslim communities. The Sharia legislation is another example of it. And what I often tell people about that, so of course there's a misperception about what Sharia is, and a lot of times with Muslims there's this like attempt to make things sound so scary and bad, and Sharia is really just a term that reflects the way of life for Muslims, and it includes so many parts of our lives. I'm currently fasting during the month of Ramadan. That would be something that falls within the Sharia of daily practices and principles of living life as a Muslim person. And so that is nothing like what they talk about when people try to use
Right.
it as a boogie word. And, even just references to the term Allah, which is the Arabic word for God, and trying to use that as a way to other and put Muslims into another category, when really it's just the Arabic word for God. And I have Christian relatives that are in Syria who use the word Allah for their God because it's the word for God in Arabic. And as an
Mm-hmm.
American Muslim, I tend to use God more than Allah because I speak English more. I mean, there's all these things that are used to try to put us in these categories and are troubling. Those legislations that took place, one of the most troubling parts of those for me was how few people joined the coalitions to try to push back against them. Because there
Yes.
were many of us that were working to push back and try to explain and work within the committees of the various legislatures about what was happening. And there were a number of people who I think would otherwise identify themselves as a social rights advocate or somebody who would stand in solidarity with communities that were impacted by these types of things, who were, missing from the scene as these things were happening. And we
Yeah.
had, our own elected officials were the ones getting up and saying this type of hatred and negative policy about and towards American Muslims. And we had to live through that. And unfortunately, that's continued to perpetuate.
Yeah.
I mean, I have felt like in the last few months, it's been so interesting, Robin, because we had a period of time where I felt like people wanted to celebrate having, Muslim representation in certain places. And the picture of the woman in the hijab in the airport in Atlanta I've seen, or in the Target stores that I've gone to, or
Yeah.
those are, to me, those were really beautiful signs of we're starting to get into a more inclusive environment. But then once we started saying things and expressing concerns, for example, for the people in Palestine, it was like people wanted to clamp a piece of tape
Yeah.
back over our mouth and say, wait, we were comfortable with the picture of you and we were comfortable when you weren't making us feel uncomfortable. But now here's the Islamophobic rhetoric
Mm,
coming back at you twofold by your president, by elected officials, by it felt like so many people. And that's where I say I think it was a humbling reminder of how deep the issues of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment still are in our country,
yeah.
and how we've got a lot of work to do to push back against them.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And I just want to reiterate something you shared with us. And this is an example of how I can be a better ally, which is to really challenge these misinformations, right? So for example, you just explained to us that this term, Sharia law,
Yeah.
it's a misnomer,
Yes.
right? These are your the way you live, your guiding principles, right? And those are coming from the Quran. But it's not like this term of law, it's not like an invasion, like you said, it's not like law, an invasion of law, but that's the co-op, of the language to scare people,
Right.
and then create legislation to try to anti Sharia law, which again is a misnomer, but it's just another flashpoint to create and institutionalize Islamophobia, and to allow people to to harass and discriminate against and to other people who self-identify as Muslim. And so this is a learning for all of us, and I think is an example and a great place as a lawyer, I think, to end, which is to really make sure that I have a clear understanding of the things that we've talked about, the terms today, their meanings, the significance in your world. And I just, Rola, I want to thank you. um, it's a lot to ask you to teach us again and again and again. We need to recognize that burden. Um, and so I appreciate you doing it again. But my hope is that I can start to learn how to do it with you, right? And lift that
Yeah.
burden.
Yes.
And
That
I
solidarity that we need.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And your leadership in the section, and as you know, the section is committed to making sure that we address all manifestations of this. So because we all, like I don't want to live in a society, we know this, right? But I don't want to live in a society that makes it so that you experience what you do when you leave your home every day. That's not the place that I want to live. So I have a duty and a responsibility. So thank you again for your time today and for your
Robin,
leadership.
thank you for saying that. That's important. That whole not being a bystander and kind of owning the responsibility. If we're in a room and we hear something, say something,
Yes.
react. Yeah, thank you.
Don't let it go.
Mhm.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I appreciate you. Thank you for your leadership and for making space for this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's what we do.
Yep.